wave in India that has taught us. Everybody is obviously fearful about what lies ahead as far as our health is concerned. So to talk about disease X, to talk about COVID and a lot more, because we could be in the fourth year of the pandemic, but the threat from an unknown pathogen is far from over. To talk about what lies ahead and what can we expect, when is going to be the new pandemic, the next pandemic, is it going to be in the next 100 years or 5 years or 10 years, and are we ready or not? Professor Ramanan Lakshminarayan is with us, a well-known epidemiologist. He's done a lot of work around COVID, including giving data about deaths, about the outcomes of this disease. And he's the director of One Health Trust. He's joining us today. And I want to begin by asking you, Professor, what is this fear that we should, what is this concern about disease X, first of all? And a lot of people ask, what is disease X? Is it lurking around the corner? Do we have any specifics about it, any specific information about it? What do you have to tell us about disease X?
Well, thank you. Thanks for that question, and thanks for having me. Clearly COVID has receded from people's minds because obviously, if it were there, a lot more people would be concerned about it. But that's the nature of how we think about pandemics. We don't think of them between pandemics. Disease X simply refers to the fact that there is potentially another pandemic around the corner. We don't know when it will be, and we don't know what the causative pathogen will be. But we know it's going to happen for a number of reasons. We know it's going to happen because take coronaviruses. Now everybody knows the word coronavirus, which was not popularly known. Coronaviruses typically cause the common cold. But just in the last 20 years, we've had 3 coronaviruses that have caused serious illnesses. SARS-1, which fortunately for reasons we don't know just died out. MERS, the Middle Eastern Respiratory Syndrome, which is transmitted from camels. Fortunately, we don't really have it in India, but it's common in the Middle East, where very high fatality rates. 60% of people who get MERS actually die. And then we, of course, have SARS-CoV-2, which is what everyone here has experienced. So you've had 3 coronavirus-related diseases that have spread globally in just 20 years. Now, why is that the case? We similarly have drug-resistant pathogens, where India has actually got the highest number of drug-resistant pathogens, in terms of disease burden in the world. We again don't know, we know that one of them is going to take off. We just don't know which one it is right now. We have bird flu, which is now decimating both bird populations as well as mammal populations around the world. The reason we're concerned about it is because bird flu H5N1 has been known since 1996. But it is now transmitting very effectively from mammal to mammal, from seals to other seals, from sea lions to other sea lions. It's in pigeons. It's certainly in domesticated, poultry. It's killing off lots of exotic wild species as well. So then the question is, at what point does it figure out not just how to jump to humans, because it has already jumped to humans. It is, people have died from bird flu, but it has not successfully jumped from one human to another yet. So when that happens, this becomes your disease X, which then hits the headline news and then people worry about it. But on any given day of the year or the week, some disease is trying to jump from animals to humans because that's where the evolutionary lottery is, and that's where they win.
You spoke about bird flu, H5N1. A lot of experts have spoken about the fact that that is going to cause the next pandemic. I just want to ask you about the risk factor as far as the fatality rates are concerned, given that the COVID fatality rates were very less as compared to what it could be for, say, the Zika virus, for example. What about bird flu?
So the only examples we have from bird flu H5N1 are the few deaths that we've had around the world, including, I believe, one in India a couple of years back, where the fatality rates are between 30 and 60%. So just to put that in perspective, COVID-19, the fatality rate was 2 out of every 1,000. So 1,000 people got COVID, 2 people would die. With bird flu, out of 1,000, that number is 600. Now, I don't want to scare you with, imagining that this is going to be some widespread fatality event just yet. But the potential exists because this disease is trying to make its way into humans. And like I said, it is now widespread in wildlife populations now and is decimating wildlife populations. And of course, we're paying attention to that for that reason, but it is a very high fatality rate.
Also I want to ask you, pathogens are zoonotic in nature. What is it that we are doing wrong? Where are we going wrong? Because we still talk a lot about the origins of COVID. A lot has been said about the wet market in Wuhan. It's still up in the air. But I just want to ask you, how is it that so many pathogens are from, have an origin from the zoonotic origin, essentially, is what I'm asking you.
So pathogens are either already in humans, in which case we have some level of protection, immune response to them and protected from them, like COVID is now. So SARS-CoV-2, we already have it. We have antibodies to it. So, in a sense, it's not likely to be a major pandemic again of that same kind, which everyone has to worry about. The reason zoonotic viruses are problematic is because we have no experience with them from an immune perspective. Our bodies have never seen them. So when they figure out, when I say figure out, it's not like they're thinking about it. This is just, evolution at work. When it works out that they're able to transmit from person to person and are successful at doing so, our bodies have no experience with them, just like our bodies had no experience with COVID back in 2020. And therefore, we're at risk for any pathogen that comes from animals that we have no prior experience with.
So a known enemy is better than an unknown enemy. And in this case, this enemy is unknown.
Oh, without question. I mean, certainly there are viruses that we really don't have experience. Most of us would not have experience with, like HIV, for instance. But that's for reasons that we've protected ourselves. But for other flu viruses, lots of respiratory viruses, many other pathogens, we've experienced them in some way or shape or form.
So, I want to ask you, what is it that we can do, given that you, among other epidemiologists and experts world over, have spoken about the fact, the WHO has just spoken about it, that the next pandemic is not going to be 100 years from now. It will be in the next 5 to 10 years, and we are not prepared for it. So what can we do to be prepared?
Well, remember that what is changing now, why this is now getting to be more common, why we think it's going to be in the next 5 to 10 years, is simply because, first, there are more humans on the planet. So if you take the entire biomass, you take in the weight of mammals on this planet, we humans are 1/3 of that. The animals that we consume, well, not all of us consume them, but certainly pigs and cattle constitute another, 60%. The remaining 10% is all the elephants and the zebras and the horses and the dogs and cats. That's the remaining, 10%. So there's a huge evolutionary win for pathogens to get to us, especially, viruses that are trying to make that jump. So it's like, we're like the Taj buffet. And, do you want to eat at the small tea shop outside, or do you want to eat at the Taj buffet? You all know the answer to that. This is what is going on there. This is really the evolutionary win. Same thing with birds as well. Poultry, mostly chicken and turkey, constitute 90% of the bird biomass on the planet. 90%. Every other sparrow, eagle, crow that you've seen is all the remaining 10%. So again, it makes sense, again, for viruses, this is where the evolutionary success comes from. So one is this: we've changed the planet in terms of what the biomass really is in and around us. So we are primarily that. The second reason is because of climate change. So climate change, typically zoonotic diseases occur when diseases spread from one animal species to another animal species. Typically, it's to a domesticated animal because that is closer to us in a sense. And that jump is happening more and more because climate change is pushing species that would never come into contact with each other now in contact, because they're all moving, right? They are keeping up with, where the warm season is, the cold season is, and all of that. So climate change is a huge driver of it. Another element of climate change, of course, is things like the melting of the Arctic permafrost. So the Siberian permafrost contains a lot of viruses and bacteria that were buried there well before humans ever came on the planet. We've only been around, to some extent, only for the last 1 to 3 million years ago. And these all predate us. So climate change is exposing a lot of that. The third reason is really just the speed of travel, which is that a virus in Wuhan can reach, Toronto, it can reach New Delhi, or it can reach, Johannesburg, literally within the time that it takes for a flight to get there. And that speed of travel just means that it's very hard to contain anything. In the old days, when it was just a ship, you could quarantine the ship, or you could, keep it away. Cholera pandemics, there have been many cholera pandemics, they all would emerge in the Bay of Bengal, and they would spread slowly over many years until eventually they would kill a lot of people in New York or Philadelphia or Baltimore. But that process would take years. Today, that process will take literally
days.
Not even. I mean, how long does it take for a flight to get from Dhaka or Calcutta to get into the East Coast of the US? You all know the answer to that. So that speed makes a difference. So these are three major reasons why this is happening.
So we are in the fourth year of the pandemic. Yes, the global emergency associated with the pandemic is over. We know that. But
the COVID pandemic.
Yes, the COVID pandemic. A lot of people, would want to know what next. When are we going to be declared pandemic free is the question. And does that even matter? Where are we as far as the pandemic is concerned? Is the threat still around, or is the worst over?
So remember, viruses are always experiencing what is called antigenic drift. So they basically are changing just a little bit when they copy themselves. They make some errors, or they figure out what helps them. That's how evolution works. So there's always going to be new subtypes that are going to be dangerous to us, and potentially we'll have to get new vaccines for COVID, maybe every other year, or, every 2-3 years or whatever. But COVID is never going to leave us. So we're always going to have COVID amongst us forever. There's no getting away from this at all. Potentially, if a subtype is more virulent, which means it kills more people, it's likely to be more of an issue for the elderly population based on our history with COVID. You can't always predict the future, but generally, influenza viruses have typically, been more fatal for the elderly population, and COVID was definitely far more dangerous for the elderly population. As you all know, if you're above 65, your risk of dying from COVID was 100 times greater than if you're in your 20s. Much, much different. So the unfortunate answer is there is no end to COVID. It is here to stay with us. But at the same time, I doubt that we'll have a repeat of what we had in 2021, for instance, because at that stage we had no immunity to it.
I also want to ask you, and this is related to COVID as well, around during COVID, and I think we realized this much later, there was a lot of misuse of drugs, including antibiotics, that was prescribed even during COVID, which was absolutely unnecessary. Talk to us a little about the problem that there is in India and outside India as far as drug resistance is concerned. And how is this hugely problematic for those people who are dealing with life-threatening diseases, and you just realize that you are resistant to this drug, and there is no way out of the disease then?
Yeah, this is actually a problem that is not in the future for India. It is there right now. Antibiotics are hugely misused, across South Asia, because we have the combination of cheaper antibiotics. There are hundreds of companies that are making antibiotics. Second is rising incomes. Everybody now in rural areas can now afford them, which is a good thing, by the way. And the third thing is that they're easily available. Without a prescription, you can walk up to the pharmacy. You don't have to go anywhere fancy. You can go to the airport, the pharmacy at the airport, and you can say you have a stomach problem. They will give you an antibiotic.
Exactly.
Most people wouldn't know an antibiotic if, even if they got one, because it doesn't say antibiotic on it. It has the name of some drug on it. You just sort of take it, right? And, fluoroquinolones, norfloxacin is very commonly used here for traveler's diarrhea kind of stuff. Now, what that has resulted in is that the bacteria, so most people also don't realize that antibiotics only work with bacteria. They don't work for viruses. But still, any cold, anything, people take an antibiotic. And as a result, the bacteria have become resistant to the antibiotics, which means that they no longer respond to the antibiotic. This is a global problem. Antibiotic resistance is now the third leading cause of death in the world. Third leading cause of death in the world, after, non-communicable diseases. And something like 5 million people die every year worldwide because of deaths associated with drug-resistant infections, a lot of them are in India itself. Now, for the reasons I mentioned, we cannot change that trajectory unless we do one of two things. One is we prevent the diseases through more vaccination, better water and sanitation, better hygiene, and through better infection prevention and control in hospitals. And the second is to really stop taking antibiotics where they're not needed. This is not just a societal problem. For each of us, when we take antibiotics inappropriately, we put ourselves at risk, we put people immediately around us at risk. And I think I was mentioning to you just before this, my daughter, who spent quite a few years in Delhi before, the first time she ever had an infection, it was drug resistant to all but one antibiotic. She had never had antibiotics in her life. So that could happen to anyone, right? So this could happen to any of us because those bacteria are everywhere. I mean, we're literally, we're surrounded by bacteria at every moment of our lives. They're on every surface. They're in the air around us. So there's no escaping the bacteria. We're like fish in this ocean of bacteria. So anything we do to mess with that population, it's going to come back to us immediately.
So what could have been the source of, the very fact that she was resistant to just so many medicines, just so many antibiotics, in spite of the fact that she had not ever taken an antibiotic all her life? So what could have been the reason behind the resistance then?
Because we're modifying everything, right? So it's in the water, it's in every other place. It could be in food. So for instance, if, women who consume chicken, which has been raised on antibiotics, have a higher risk of developing drug-resistant urinary tract infections. And up to the age of 65, women have, unfortunately, a higher risk of UTIs than men do. After that, it evens out. Now, that's because it's in our food. It's in the water. It's in, it's in every surface really around us. So nobody has to go out and be exposed particularly to drug-resistant bacteria. The bacteria have just become drug-resistant all around us.
There's been some conversation around chicken. A lot of people love chicken. I love chicken. I just want to ask you, what is it that poultry does in terms of, blocking or preventing that, or rather ensuring that we then become resistant to just so many medicines, given that our poultry we know is fed with antibiotics. Plus, as far as climate change is concerned, we've spoken about climate change and how it is deeply related to health, deeply related to diseasex and pathogens, known and unknown. What is it that poultry does is what I want to know, because India is a country that consumes poultry. Our consumption is high. We are a chicken-eating country. So just talk to us a little about that.
So full disclosure, I'm vegetarian, but I don't mean to imply that anyone should be vegetarian. That's not the idea.
We should not be... We can eat chicken, right?
Yeah, well, you can eat chicken, but you have to realize that the more chicken you eat that is raised on antibiotics, you are putting yourself at risk as far as drug-resistant infections go, because these chickens are now raised on antibiotics. This practice has now changed in Europe. It's changed in the United States and the US. It happened in about 2014, 2015, where, quite rapidly, the poultry industry moved away from using antibiotics at all. It's not something that's beyond the reach of Indian industry to do. You can easily do that as well. But it is just that it's like, it's like driving an SUV and climate change. Doesn't mean that you don't drive anywhere, but you have to be mindful of the fact that every time you're driving, you're contributing to climate change. That's the same thing with the chicken issue, which is the more you consume, there's a greater risk, both for yourself and everyone around you. But that just is the nature of, what that risk is. And as far as climate change itself goes, I think that's more associated with livestock really than chicken, mostly to do with methane and those emissions. I think 15% of global carbon emissions are related to livestock. India does have a lot of livestock, by the way. In fact, India has more livestock than China, the European Union, and the US all put together. So, but those livestock are not being consumed per se. Those are just out there. But that's a different question. But as far as chicken goes, I think we do want to be mindful of the health impacts that it does have.
Coming back to diseasex, a couple of questions. First of all, are we prepared? Is India prepared is my question to you. I'll come to the developed countries in a bit from now. But first of all, is India prepared?
So there is no such thing as a country necessarily being prepared beyond just having a good public health system. So what does that preparedness really mean? It means having good disease surveillance. It's getting better for sure here. It's about having the healthcare facilities not just in urban areas but also in rural areas. There's certainly improvements on that front, although a lot more needs to happen on that front. It means about having better vaccination coverage, which India has improved quite a bit in the last, the last 10 years. Vaccination coverage has increased. It's about water and sanitation. It's about infection prevention in hospitals. So I think these are indicators that need much more focus, but certainly improving over time. Beyond that, there is not a specific preparation per se for a disease X, because very likely this disease will emerge from outside of the country. Right, it could happen from Southeast Asia, which is where a lot of these viruses typically, at least historically, have come from. But if the disease X happens to be a fungal pathogen, it could happen from right here. We didn't talk much about fungal pathogens. Those are problematic because there are no vaccines and we have very, very few drugs to treat those with. We saw mucormycosis, black fungus during COVID. Terrible. And fungal pathogens are now increasing because of climate change. And they're getting to be much, much more deadly. We don't observe them because we're not seeing the numbers up yet, but it'll happen. As far as drug-resistant bacteria go, there's already the problem in India. So this is something which public health has to really reckon with, make sure that antibiotics are used less in the cities. In rural areas, they do need more antibiotics because a lot of people do die because of lack of antibiotics. So there needs more, but less certainly in the urban areas. So I think these are what India can do to prepare, but the major preparation will have to be in cooperating with other countries, like through the pandemic accord, which is now being discussed at the World Health Organization, to be able to ensure that when a disease actually occurs, wherever it is, that everyone gets to know about it.
We're in it together.
We're all in it together. This is like climate change. You can't fight it country by country. It has to be, global. The second is that we cooperate with other countries to make sure that a vaccine will be quickly available for everyone. India was fortunate to have vaccine manufacturing capacity. A lot of poor countries, in Africa, for instance, did not have access to vaccines, and they're very upset about it naturally. So that equity also needs to be there, because we heard this during COVID. None of us is safe unless all of us are safe. And I think we don't really pay attention to what that really means. It really is true. If there are people somewhere else with the disease, we are all immediately at risk.
Right. For those who may actually not know what a pandemic accord will entail, what does it really mean to have a pandemic accord? Why is it important to have a pandemic accord, given that the WHO has been stressing on it for a while now? Just talk to us a little about what that is going to mean and how is it going to help us in an eventuality of yet another pandemic.
Right. So I'll just, step back a little bit, because, the world agrees on certain things, right? The Montreal Protocol for ozone, or say on Paris Accords for climate, for instance. Before the world agreed on anything, the world more than 170 years ago agreed that diseases had to be reported. Why? Because if neighbor has a disease and I don't know about it, then I'm at risk immediately. So the idea that countries would cooperate on disease is a very old idea. It goes back to the 1850s, way before anything else. But that said, those protocols have not kept up with the needs of today, where, like I said, someone with a disease can, spread it across the world in, 12 hours. And what that really requires is countries cooperating in preventing, predicting and reporting, and then responding to pandemics. Now, the lack of agreement globally is because not everyone wants to be able to share information, because they are worried that if I share information about a pandemic, if it doesn't turn out to be the case, then you will impose sanctions on me and then my economy will go down. Or if I'm making vaccines, I want it just for my people first before I give it to anyone else. So in a large way, we're going about pandemic preparedness thinking we can fight this country by country without realizing that we're all in it together. And when I say this, I don't mean India per se. There's a lot of disagreement going on right now globally on how to get countries to cooperate. And to cooperate, it is for every country to see that they have a self-interest in everyone else also being protected. Now, unfortunately, that's usually not how countries interact with each other in these fora. So we're having a bit of a problem with getting that agreement going. The deadline was supposed to be that this will be adopted at the World Health Assembly in May this year. It's looking quite difficult that we'll get a pandemic accord this year. There's a global pandemic fund that was sent up under the World Bank, and total amount that they have is a small fraction of what was required. So somehow, after millions of people dying around the world, 2 years later, everyone has forgotten and gone home and gone on to the next problem. And we've forgotten that this is actually still a threat which is going to come up next. So, I mean, it's just the nature of us as humans, right?
No lessons learned.
No lessons learned. We forget very quickly, and then we'll be surprised when the next pandemic also comes along. So, but
like I was telling you, I think the problem really is that until the time it really hits us,
yes,
the problem comes knocking at our doors. I think we don't realize the significance of putting our focus and attention on things that actually matter. And I think that really is our health.
Yeah, it's like a prediction of
Yes.
bad news, right? Who wants a prediction of bad news?
Yes,
And that's what epidemiologists do, and that's why we're not particularly popular that way. But when you come back, this is what is going to happen. This is as clockwork as anything else. Nature works in a fairly predictable way.
All right, that was an insightful conversation. I'm going to thank you so much for joining us. And I think the big takeaway really from here is that the pandemic, like we would think, a lot of people say that it's a way, the Spanish flu hit us in the year 1914, 1915, 1918. So it was 100 years ago, and the next is going to be 100 years from now. Oh, we won't be around. I think that really is not true. And I think the sooner we realize that, the better.
I hope so.
All right. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thanks,